everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? It all seems to be too chaotic to understand at the moment. There are too many complex parts interacting. Ninth wave of COVID, the absolute chaos of the election here in the United States, as well as the seemingly destabilizing the election in Venezuela. The report that the climate catastrophe is actually supposed to happen decades earlier than was last projected, and so much more. I am just trying to find some amount of joy, some amount of community in all of this, and find joy in the things I do, such as today's episode. This is Doug Henwood. If you don't know who Doug is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Teaneck, New Jersey, journalist and political writer Doug Henwood has been writing publicly about politics since he started his newsletter Left Business Observer, which ran from 1986 until 2013. He's also written for Harper's, The Village Voice, Jacobin, and is a contributing editor at The Nation. That was just a condensed list of places he's written for, by the way. In addition, Doug has written 4 books: State of the USA Atlas, Wall Street, After the New Economy, and My Turn, Hillary Clinton Targets the Presidency. Currently, he hosts the weekly KPFA Berkeley radio show and podcast, Behind the News. I first read Doug in Harper's almost a decade ago, and I thought he was such a great writer and insightful. And recently I was rereading an article of his in Jacobin called Take Me to Your Leader, The Rot of the American Ruling Class. It's a fantastic article, and it really documents one of the things that I've been obsessed with, which is what happens materially in the 1970s to change us over from kind of the old money wasps who kind of like cared about, they were psychopaths, but they cared about business and the businesses that they owned in a way that they were looking towards the future. So they wouldn't just, destroy another business just to suck out the capital. But that all changed through the 70s and 80s into, where you get these kind of new money, nouveau riche arrivistes, as Doug writes in his essay. And he goes through like this change, and it's fascinating. We talk a little bit about that through the lens of him growing up, because he is a teenager in the 70s into his 20s. And he had a front row seat as culture changed. And so we talk about that along with the things in his childhood that led him to the moral and journalistic path he has been on for most of his life. So I hope you enjoy it. Doug's an interesting dude, and I've wanted to talk to him for a long time, since I first read him in Harper. So I'm really glad that we could do this. Coming up on the show, speaking of politics, coming up on the show in a couple of weeks, I talked to Matt Bors. Matt Bors is a political cartoonist. He was the editor and founder of The Nib, which was a wonderful political cartoon site that I subscribed to, that he closed down a year or two ago and is much missed. So I talked to him, a ton of musicians coming up on the show next week. Asher White. Asher describes herself as kind of Elephant Sixy, which I hadn't seen until she said that. And then I was like, oh, I guess I see it. But she is her own person. So it was a really good conversation. So stay tuned for that. But for now, let's talk to Doug. Over email that you're like, well, I don't know if my childhood's that interesting.
That's correct.
But, well, this is the thing. When I talk to people, I have this theory. I used to be a philosophy professor. I mean, I guess that's not needed as part of the preface, but just so you're like, well, this guy is credentialed, so he's not just spouting nonsense. I think there's a deep connection between aesthetics and ethics.
Uh-huh.
And so when I talk to people on the show, from entertainment, and I'm talking about like their aesthetics. And then when I talk to people in journalism or from academic writing, I talk about ethics a lot of the time, because I think the development of these things, of these faculties in us, is very much tied to our childhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I credit why I'm an ethical person to my parents' staunch, kind of like very broomstick up their butts morality. And I'm curious. So here's another thing as a parenthetical. You're from Teaneck. You grew up in Teaneck?
No, I was born there. I grew up nearby in Westwood, Washington Township.
Okay. Well, my wife's family is from, I won't say the exact place in case they don't want to it on in public media. So I know the area pretty well. And I'm kind of curious, in that area, what was it like growing up there? You're growing up there in like the 50s and the 60s, right?
I was born in 52. Yeah. And I went to college in 71 and came back just after college for a year because I couldn't find out what to do with my life. So I spent, and then I left for good in 76 to go to graduate school.
In the 50s. So let's start with like the childhood part. What is that area like? What is North New Jersey right across the GW? What's that like at that time? Like, this is because another thing that I'm interested in is you become an adult also at this time that I'm very fascinated with, that you write about, that David Harvey writes about, that if you've ever seen the Adam Curtis documentary, The Mayfair Set,
I didn't see that, no.
It's great. But this whole time when the old money kind of falls away and you have this, as you've said, like this kind of nouveau riche Arabiste set come in, and all of you write about these material changes that come in. And I'm kind of curious, what's handed to me is that these times are idyllic, that the 1950s, at least for white people, are idyllic. What was it actually like for you? Is it like Leave It to Beaver? Is it like My Three Sons? Or what was your experience growing up in the 1950s into the 60s?
Well, it really was the prototype of that, just that kind of post-World War II suburb. My parents were both upwardly mobile, working class origins from Hudson County, came to Bergen after, I think they bought the house in 51. And it was like $13,000 when they bought it, I believe. I didn't really know much about the outside world, but it seemed all right to me. It seemed pretty dull. The older I got and the more I became aware of the outside world, it seemed suffocating and provincial. But when I as a kid, everything seemed pretty nice. Everything was pretty comfortable. Everything was pretty insular. And as far as I can tell now, it's much more of a upper middle class kind of place. Then, I've just reconnected with an old friend of mine from high school days. Her father was a house painter. There were people who had professional jobs. My father was an accountant, but they were teachers. But it was not that kind of class homogeneity that you see in most American towns these days. It was a little of everything. Everybody lived together. The cost of living was not very extravagant, and it was the classic post-World War II complacent suburb. We thought we had achieved nirvana on earth, really. And then, I go off to college and I see all these people. I went to Yale, and there's this whole universe I didn't even know existed of these upper class people who came out of prep schools. I just never seen anything like it. But then I was also in New Haven, which is a poor town outside of the Yale area. So I saw an array of class extremities I'd never seen before.
Is that the first time that kind of breaks that bubble of this kind of idyllic, like, utopia in your mind?
Well, I was I read a lot. I was pretty aware of what was going on around me, but just as something I lived through, I just lived in this very isolated suburb. I'd go to New York City for fun, starting as a teenager, but I'd just back to this bedroom community at night. My father would take the bus to and from Manhattan every day. He hated every minute of it. But for the most part, it was not a world where diversity reigned. It was very white too. There's one street in town, Sand Road in Westwood. We had the two towns together, Westwood and Washington Town. The township had a common school system. Westwood was an older railroad suburb, developed in the 20s, and some much nicer housing, in that old style sense. But there's this one street in town where all the black people lived, and maybe 20 families, maybe, I don't know. I wouldn't have an exact count, but it was very small. And Washington Township was much more of a post-World War II town. A lot of ugly new housing. So there was that was what passed for diversity in the Westwood Consolidated School District in the 1960s.
So at what point does the outside world start impinging upon the suburb that you're in, right? Is it JFK being assassinated? Like, at what point do you start to does it start to really leak in?
Oh, well, the JFK, everybody talks about that. You remember where you were, and the loss of innocence. The U.S. there's some character in Yeats that just is always regaining its virginity or restoring its virginity, and that's like America, always losing its innocence but somehow recovering it again. It seems like, it was the 60s started exploding, and I would listen to WBAI radio at that time, and now that radio station is just an embarrassment. But then it was really a pretty lively thing culturally, all kinds of a merger of politics and counterculture and early gay culture. So, that's kind of piped in an alternative reality for me. So I became aware of that. And, I'd follow the news and politics. So I was always aware of what's going on in the outside world. I was in fifth grade gym class when we got news of the Kennedy assassination. Everyone was stunned. And there were a series of events around that time that really started breaking the bubble of American innocence. I also recall the early great crimes, the Career Girl murders, and that sort of thing. Janice Wiley and Emily Hofford, I can still remember their names, and Kitty Genovese, and all these. The sense that the stable order of the 50s and early 60s was coming unstuck through crime, but protest and war, and the familiar 60s story. So that's how I started experiencing it somewhat personally, although my day-to-day life didn't really change that much. It was the end of innocence, the loss of innocence. After a number of repetitions of the loss of innocence, I guess it finally sticks.
Did that start to change your psychic life, though? Because you said your day-to-day life, the way that I describe my day-to-day life now is I'm I'm personally safe, but I feel insane seeing kind of the dystopia descend upon me. So my
Where do you
brain,
live?
I live in Los Angeles.
Uh-huh.
And again, it's not it's not on me. I'm fine. This is the thing where I'm it's this kind of contradiction that sits in my soul where I'm personally safe, at least at the moment. Who knows at what point if things fall apart for whatever reason, avian flu or fascism really kind of
there's any number of things you can point to.
Yeah, we can whatever. But there are certain things that could happen where I'm not wealthy enough to be safe, but at the moment I'm fine. Yet I see all of the contradictions happening in society around me, and I'm that could blossom into something awful. And so my brain sits in a kind of anxiety all the time. And I'm wondering, did any of this stuff affect you psychically at the time?
Some of the crime stuff did. I recall it being afraid that somebody's going to break into the house and stab me or something. But the day-to-day life was very stable and safe. And you'd see, I was 20 miles from New York City. That's where all the disorder was.
Right.
There's a sense of, and I envied it. I wanted some of that urban disorder. And I moved here after I left graduate school in 1979, and I've been here ever since. I moved to New York City during the high crime days. And just after the fiscal crisis, so everything was falling apart, which kept rents low, but did create a sense of dread all the time. But it was also, to me, it was just exhilarating, really, to be away from that tedious suburban lifestyle. So yeah, I didn't really feel much personal threat from all those things that were going on. I was concerned about getting drafted, and I found a nice doctor in Teaneck, eye doctor, who would testify that I got the phrase from the Selective Service Manual was frequent and incapacitating migraines, which would disqualify me for service. So I had that lined up, but fortunately my draft number came up so high it didn't come up. But yeah. I was afraid of that, but otherwise I just borrow the family car and go drive in the Palisades Parkway and do all those things that suburban kids did in those days.
Yeah, I like having these conversations because, again, the stuff that's handed to me is a montage of hippies and Vietnam set to all along the Watchtower. And then
yes.
Talking to people who actually lived through the era, it's like, well, no, I mean, it was mostly like, like the same stuff I did in the 90s, which is driving to Blockbuster. I mean, not you didn't drive to Blockbuster, but like hanging out outside of Blockbuster with my friends and then going and watching a movie or something. Like that was most of my life.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I kind of envied the hippies. I've never been a fan of hippie culture, but there was something about the freedom that represented. I'd take the bus into the big city and to go down to Greenwich Village and watch all the lifestyle experimentation going on. But I never really felt part of that. I watched it from a distance. There was some stuff in my high school where there were some anti-war protests. I had this band director who was this right-wing Texan who would make fun of me for being too much of a communist. Our school principal got fired because he was seen as a bit too much of a reformer. Got replaced by this crew-cut Marine type. So there was, that was some of the intrusion of the outside world on the complacent world of Westwood, New Jersey. But like I said, most of my life was very much in the bubble.
Did you think you had a sense of self back then, like who you were or who you wanted to be?
Oh, I knew I wanted to be some kind of like writer or intellectual or bohemian or something from a pretty early age. There was some of that in my mother's family. She played the piano, I think, quite well, although she'd stopped playing it by the time I was conscious. And a lot of books in the house. So I picked up some of that from her family. Her brother was a journalist. So I picked up some degree of high culture that was passed along to me. I really came to like classical music a lot through her. And, I still do. So I got this sense that I wanted to be, not like one of these men in gray flannel suits. My father was not like a really high-end character achiever or anything, but he was still, went to work and led the straight life. And I thought, that sounds pretty boring. So, I had some ambitions of how I'd like it to be different, but I knew so little about what that world was like. So like I said, when I got to Yale, it was just like, this world, man, I didn't know all this shit was going down. And so it was all a revelation to me, the whole panoply of the American class spectrum in front of me, which I had never seen before. But also, just so much intellectual richness and stuff to get into. The university has a really nice art gallery. You can go look at really nice paintings, which is not something I grew up doing. So that I thought was very, very exciting. But I just had these as a youngster. I just had these fantasies of being some sort of bohemian, not a hippie, but bohemian, I guess, in the old 1920s sense.
I want to go back to this and your dad in a second, but I want to stick with the Yale thing because something that I talk about a lot on the show is my shock. Like my first understanding of class was going to family friend's house, who was the father was a doctor. And so they were wealthier than us, but it's not like they were like massively wealthy, but just like it was enough that I was suddenly aware that I didn't know the rules that they lived by. And through my, I live in Los Angeles now, and I am, around scions and like the children of people who went to private schools and things like that. And like, so I'm from Pennsylvania, and I went to a place called Exeter Township High School. And I would just say, oh, I went to Exeter.
Oh, yes.
And I didn't, yeah, exactly. See, you get it, right? And then it took me until I was in this world to realize, oh, they think I mean Exeter Phillips. They think I mean that I went to this private school. And then once, like, I remember there was a point where where they thought that, and then later in the conversation, they realized that I didn't mean that. And the tenor changed. And I'm kind of curious, did you have inklings before you went to Yale of this that like prepared you in any way, or was it really this huge shock, and how did you adjust?
Well, like I said, there was not too much in the way of a yawning class gap within the town. So some people had more money, some people had less, but it's just not, it didn't have the salience as that sort of thing does now. I mean, it's just like, the gap between rich and poor now, and all the social privileges that go with it, or the lack of social privileges that go with it, it's just very palpable in daily life now. And that just did not exist. There was none of this sense of dread that people have about the future. And this extended well into, I went to graduate school in the late 70s in Charlottesville, Virginia. And there are people who had just graduated from the college at University of Virginia. And they were just hanging out and not doing much, working carpentry or something. And we'd go down and meet at the happy hour and have beers every evening. And it was just, life was a lot easier. And you just didn't have that sense that if you didn't find a career path, you're going to end up on homeless or something. That sense did not exist. Although I do recall, as I was graduating from college, I entered at the very final stage of the endless American corporate cornucopia. So I entered college in 1971. And then the 1974-75 recession, which was then the worst then since the 1930s, hit. And that we all were very aware that something had broken, that something had really changed, that the golden age, we had no way of phrasing it at that point, but we did have some kind of instinctive understanding that that golden age was over and things were going to get a lot harder. We used to make jokes about, I had a friend whose family had a house in the Hamptons. But even then, the Hamptons were kind of posh, but there was not hedge fund money in the mid and late 70s. So, but we'd joke about going out to the Hamptons and growing potatoes in the backyard, because they were still growing potatoes in Eastern Long Island in those days. But that was dark humor, but it was not something that we would have said 3, 4, or 5 years earlier. So yeah, you could see a real change in the cast of American life. And then just after I graduated, a very rich South Korean threw this gigantic party at Yale in the Commons, which is the freshman dining hall, which is now named after Steve Schwartzman. A measure of changes over time. But he threw this extravagant party. And everyone was like, what the hell? We had not seen anything like it. Because in those days, people with money even were discreet about it. I had a good friend who came from a very fancy social pedigree, had some money in the family, and she was just, acted like a normal person. The people didn't flaunt it, and then that really started changing. Like I said, probably the 76 or 77, that big party happened. And then, of course, things did changed extensively in the 1980s, but you could see the first signs of change at that point. But like I say, it just didn't, day-to-day life was not filled with the sense of anxiety and dread that it is now. And certainly nothing like the climate crisis and, worrying about human extinction.
Yeah. What do you think? Okay, so I know like you can't get inside the mind of the person that threw the party, right? But I'm kind of curious, as this first here's this guy kind of ostentatious extravagance that I haven't seen before. What do you think is going on after that? Like you said, there was this like break in the 70s where suddenly we're like, maybe we'll like start farming, and which is something my wife and I talk about often. It's like, do we actually try to buy a house here in Los Angeles, or should we try to buy a house somewhere near the Great Lakes and learn how to farm? Like, what do you think's going on?
I would hate farming. I would be a miserable farmer. Just, God,
I
know. It would be hell for me. It's like being a POW.
Yeah, but I'm just like, maybe this is what's happening. Like, it's our industry is creating a little bit. Like, we're doing okay at the moment, but it's just like, we don't know if this is sustainable, and especially if like everything starts collapsing. It's like, well, I guess, do we learn how to subsist? Is that what's happening? In the 70s.
And these are, by official measures, relatively prosperous times too, and people still have that sense that everything is falling apart.
I know. I think it's because if you have your ear to the ground, you see what's happening to the people that are just slightly less well off than you. And they weren't like that before. And the people who were slightly less well off than them weren't as bad as they were before. And you kind of see it creeping up, right? To the point where there was I was listening to a podcast with this academic, I forget his name, but he was writing about the environmental crisis. And he said there is left-wing realism and right-wing realism. And the left-wing realism is like, we should do something about this. We should change society. And the right-wing realism is like, yeah, there's a climate crisis and it's a gamble. We'll probably lose all of our privileges if we actually change society. And if there's an actual climate crisis, it's maybe like a coin flip whether we lose our privileges. And 1 billion people or more will die, but we probably, it's better off for us rationally to just let 1 billion people or more die, and we probably retain our privileges, than to gamble with changing society from the ground up, and where we probably surely will lose our privileges. That mentality, that idea stuck with me, or is in my head. I'm just, again, go back to this, like, because again, I take the mid 70s, or I take the 70s as this pivotal moment where everything changes, where like reality becomes unhinged in a certain way. And if you have enough money, you get to like live in your own reality. This extravagance.
Yeah, that was not quite so present in the 70s. It was a period of transition. And I spent a lot of time looking at what elites were doing in that period. And they were really starting around 76-ish. They started organizing, to use the Marxist terminologies, as a class in themselves. They had, or for themselves rather. They really became conscious of their interests in a way that they hadn't until then, and like really pushing for a political renovation from their point of view. But still, that was happening in the kind of out of view
right.
of society. It really all became visible in the early 80s with Reagan and Thatcher abroad. That whole moment. The Volcker interest rate shock, all that business. That was such a palpable class war. It all became very visible at that moment. Stuff that had been happening sort of kind of under the surface then really became extremely obvious what was going on.
But do you think that that mid 70s, that moment where like you were like, well, maybe I should become a farmer? Do you think there was this elite feeling of like, screw it, we're just going to do what we want? Or, it doesn't matter. Like, we don't have to keep this sustainable. We're just going to extract as much as possible and just live the lives we want to live.
Well, I think going back to the topic of that extravagant party at Yale, I think that was a sign that a certain subset of society was really like wanted to show you how much they had. And part of showing you how much they had was showing you how much you didn't have. It's like, as economists call it, positional goods. Their value exists in the fact that I have it and you don't. So that you can start seeing signs of that developing. But still, it's also a time of punk rock and fiscal crisis in New York City. Everything was falling apart. For poor people in New York City, the fiscal crisis was terrible. The loss of public services, the decay of the physical and social environment, all those things were bad. But on the other hand, if you had a little money, rents were low, and you could be an artist or a musician and not have to work for the man quite so slavishly. So there was an upside to that completely disappeared
Yeah.
by the early 1980s.
Well, that's my question then too, because after you graduate undergrad, right? You then work. At least this is what I read online. You work for a small Wall Street firm, right?
Yeah, it didn't last very long, but I was. I was kind of interested in the stock market. I had an uncle who lived with us when I was growing up. He subscribed to Barron's, and I'd read Alan Abelson's column every week because Abelson was really a very good stylist, good writer, and he was always somewhat skeptical about the Wall Street culture. He's making fun of Wall Street people. So I read him, and I kind of like this stock market thing is kind of interesting. So right out of college, like I said, it was 1975. The recession. I'm not sure whether the recession was formally over by then, but it certainly felt deeply recessionary. And New York City was in fiscal crisis. So, everything felt like it was in crisis. Everything was falling apart. It was not the Great Depression, but the almost Great Depression, it seemed like. But I did manage to get this job as basically a secretary to the chairman of this small Wall Street firm. And I kind of was interested in it. And I still have it, this love-hate relationship with that whole world and with the elites that populate it. But in those days, Wall Street it didn't really become culturally salient until the bull market took off in 82, 83. So Wall Street was, kind of a backwater. People made money, but they didn't make money like, by the truckload like they do now. But my boss had been a physicist at Bell Labs, and his idea was to bring mathematics to Wall Street. And they'd just begun trading listed options, and he was trying to develop pricing models. And the famous Black and Scholes option pricing models, for which they won the Nobel Prize, were just published, and he was trying to develop daily valuations, which were undervalued options, which were overvalued options, which were undervalued options. And I would go around distributing his work. It was like everything was on a computer printout. So I'd go around with these hefty
dot matrix printer,
stacks of dot matrix printer. Yeah. On these, folding, whatever we call those folding sheets of paper.
Yeah. With the sides you have to rip off.
Yeah. Yeah. And deliver them to various his clients, which is just, ridiculous in these days where computers trade in nanoseconds now. But that's the way it was in 1976. But then some client of the firm bought a whole bunch of IBM stock that he couldn't pay for, so they went under. And then I only lasted 6-7 months. And then I said, the hell with this. I think I'm going to go to graduate school. So I got a job as a librarian at a law firm. On Lower Broadway, also in the financial district, pretty much right across the street from the first job. But I knew that was going to be temporary. I remember this law firm, they specialized in admiralty law. And so they had like seamen who were injured in the course of work suing the shipping lines. And I remember sitting in the office with the library one day, and this 3 or 4 lawyers were sitting around trying to figure out how they could make a jurisdictional argument against this guy's suit. I mean, this guy had been crippled by his accident, but they were trying to figure out he should be suing in federal court and he's suing in state court or vice versa. I can't remember what it was, but they're trying to using these techniques to deny this guy any kind of righteous settlement. So I said, man, what scum. These people are just as bad as, the Wall Street of caricature.
So, okay, just to I want to figure out the existential thing. Did the firm that was started by the Bell Labs guy go under before you quit, or did you quit and then it went under?
No, I got fired. I remember I went into work one morning and started doing my thing, and the boss said, I want to talk to you. And so it was all over.
Okay. So you didn't make the decision to leave. It was
no. It was made for me. And we'd been talking in, the previous weeks about what my longer term plans were. I was doing I took some computer programming in college. I knew some Fortran, so I was trying to work on his model making I was never skilled enough to do that seriously, but I was trying to. So there was that, and I don't know. If I'd stayed around, I probably would have moved in something like that direction.
Hmm.
But it just didn't happen.
Yeah. When did you make an existential decision about the direction of your life?
I don't know if I ever made one. It just sort of happened. But what's that line? There's a line from Gaddis's J.R., which is a book I read during that period, and I loved
Oh,
it very
yeah.
much.
It's great.
But life is what goes on while the real plans are being made elsewhere. And that seemed to summarize my philosophy of life at the moment. Um, but yeah, so I had this job at the law firm, and that's not something that's going to last. It was just a way to make some money, and I saved money to go to spend the summer in Italy, which I did. But that was partly so I could learn Italian and go to graduate school and have a language to put on my CV. But somewhere around then, I thought, screw this, I'm going to become an academic. And so I went to graduate school with the intention of becoming a professor of English somewhere at the time. Yeah. So I spent a few years doing that. I spent 3 years down there and said, maybe this isn't for me. I didn't really like teaching that much.
Ah,
I liked the reading and writing part, but I
yes.
didn't enjoy teaching that much. So I said, I've always wanted to live in New York. And so I met this woman down there. We ended up getting married, but we decided to move to New York together in 1979, just after I did my orals, my doctoral orals. And so I never did write a dissertation, but yeah, so I came to New York and then got a job in publishing and thought, no, maybe I'll do this publishing thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I left academia the same time as you. I mean, at the same stage as you. But I just didn't like the structures of the university. I didn't like what I was being asked to do. I didn't like that I would have to wait till I got tenure to write about what I want to write about. And I found that the concerns of academic philosophy were just so worthless that the things that I was being asked to write about were worthless and that didn't help anyone or were not meaningful in any way. That's what got to me.
Yeah, well, the Yale English department when I was an undergraduate was really an exciting place. It was when theory was starting to explode. Harold Bloom was there, who was a big undergraduate hero of mine.
Right.
Jeffrey Hartman, who I took several classes with. There was the old new critics too, like Cleanth Brooks, old reactionary Southern, fugitive type, who would talk nostalgically about the Confederacy now and then.
Yikes.
But then, Jacques Derrida was there visiting. Paul de Man was there. So it was,
wow.
it was a really exciting place to be studying English. And I took a year off and then go to University of Virginia. Just none of that was happening down there. The major domo of the department, who had just retired, was this guy named Fredson Bowers, a real O-line, he's like bibliographer. He'd do things like textual emendations and Shakespeare. And a friend of mine decided to drop out of the program when he overheard somebody in the lounge saying, "Oh, he's doing great new work on Tennyson's letters." That was like, yeah, no, I don't know, it just wasn't for me. And so, I don't know if it had been a more exciting department intellectually, I might have stuck around.
Sure. You're reading like Gaddis and Barth and Elkin, I'm sure. And, they're asking you to look at like 15th century poetry or.
Well, 18th century was one of the big departments down there. And, I'm sure there's a lot of great literature written during that period. I didn't read much of it. I was interested in 19th and 20th century American and British poetry, so that was my thing. I was going to do a dissertation on Wallace Stevens and the Emerson, Whitman, Stevens, that whole line of American Romanticism. That was my thing. But I was going to do a psychoanalytic examination of narcissism in that school of American poetry.
Oh, I love that.
So I was reading a lot of psychoanalysis. I did find an advisor who was really into psychoanalysis. So there was that, and that was the dissertation I was going to write that I never did. But then I also got the idea of how tying the evolution in that narcissism to evolutions in the political economy, from like small scale competitive capitalism into finance bureaucratic capitalism. And so I somehow going to link that evolution to an aesthetic, a psychoaesthetic of the narcissism.
Yeah.
I never did that, but I'm still, very interested in psychoanalysis. And I sometimes regret not having done it just so I could have the credential.
Do you think that prior to this change in the 70s that the ruling elite were narcissists, or is that more of something that is like that the structures have changed to privilege real narcissists now? Because everyone that I see that's in part of the ruling elite or that I meet seems to be just like an outright narcissist, like clinically.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's definitely the case. So, when I was at Yale, it was really the final days of WASP dominance of American culture. So, a lot of WASPs at Yale, these guys, no socks and topsiders. And I was like, who are these weirdos? I didn't know anything about who these people were. I wrote about this in Harper's a few years ago. So I kind of envied them. I envied their, certainly not their stylishness. They had none of that, but the confidence, the sense that the world is theirs by inheritance. I was jealous of that, frankly, and but those people were really still very dominant in the cultural and in politics. And I wouldn't say that their personal pathology is narcissistic. That seems like much more of an Aravist affliction.
Yeah. Because that's what it's, again, I only see this through the lens of history, so I don't know what the truth is. But it did seem that there was, with the old WASP order, as much as there was an insane arrogance, there was an arrogance that was supposed to be, noblesse oblige, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's bullshit propaganda to some degree, but not really, not entirely. Okay. No, there's a core of truth to it. Yeah. There's this famous story about Barbara Bush, and W came home one day to report that his baseball team, that he'd done really well in the baseball game. And Barbara said to him, "That's very nice, George, but how did the team do?" And, there's a whole lot of propaganda and posturing around that sort of thing, but it's not completely made up. Whereas now it's just the emphasis is so much on, me and my personal accomplishments. And that sense of collegiality is gone. But I think that came from the kind of world that produced those WASPs. They all were intermarried. They went to the same schools, belonged to the same clubs, and there was not the kind of competitiveness and this meritocracy that afflicts us now, where everybody it's just the difference of, for example, of Yale then and now is just remarkable. Like it's so hard to get into Yale now. Everybody is just like, phenomenally accomplished at everything. And it just, in my day, it was like, there were gentlemen's seas and people, hung out, and it was just a lot more comfortable. And that was to some degree that WASP culture, which is, you don't want to appear like you're trying too hard. You don't want to stand out too much. You're just a good team player. And for all its problems, I think in some ways it makes for a better society than one we have now.
Did you want that going into Yale? Was it something that you wanted while you were at Yale? Did you want it at all?
Well, I didn't really get exactly what it was when I got there. It was all new to me. Although I think I understood to some degree that a very well established culture of inherited privilege, and I think I, in some sense, understood that and wanted a piece of it. I know the institution, from the minute you arrive, it cultivates this sense that the world is yours for the taking, and it instills a confidence that it's very important, get all pretentious and use Bourdieu's habitus, but it is that sense of one's posture towards the world gets really reshaped at an institution like that. And I wanted it for sure. Uh, but obviously not quite enough to go to law school or become a financier.
Okay, well, that's what I'm curious about. When I do talk to people who go to elite institutions, but who end up not not following the habitus of whatever that institution is, or whatever, the class is that it's trying to indoctrinate you into their beliefs, right? What was it about you that insulated you from that? Is it just a quirk of your personality? Was it your beliefs going into the institution? Was it, again, like I asked before, like, did you have a sense of self that made it difficult for you to be indoctrinated?
Well, it's like that sense of bohemianism that I mentioned earlier. I just didn't want that. I wanted to be, again, I may draw on board you, that sense of the bohemian who thinks, is sort of part of that class, but not part of it, and critical. This book by Paul Fussell, which I love a lot, Class, which is a taxonomy of the American class system from the early 80s, is it, when he wrote that. There's what he calls this X class that thinks of itself as kind of apart from it all. And that I think appealed to me, that being the artistic or critical type is really what appealed to me. So, being a professor of English was a way to have it both ways. You could write about literature and critically and have some politics, but also have a comfortable life.
Yeah, that deeply resonates. That really gets to the core of myself. Yeah, that's it.
Well, and I have to say I've been very lucky. I have had a comfortable life for decades, and I'm very grateful for it. I give thanks every day. I've never had to really have a really crappy job. I've been able to get through life doing pretty much what I want to, and I'm very aware that I'm very lucky in that.
You noted that your dad at least didn't like the commute into Manhattan. Did he like being an accountant?
Oh, no. He was bored every minute.
Okay. Did you know that when you were a kid? Like, did you catch a whiff of that, either regret or resentment or whatever?
Whiffs, but he'd never really talked about it. He's a male of that generation, and didn't really talk much about his feelings. And also both my parents were just driven by this sense of responsibility and duty, that pleasure was something you didn't really think about or seek or indulge in. You just did what you had to do.
Yeah, real Kantians, right? Like that kind of, like, I think about that a lot when I think of like moral duty.
Yeah, and I just found that very, very alienating.
Interesting. Okay, so that didn't resonate with you at all.
Well, I said my mother did have her own artistic streak amidst all the responsibility. And I think, she married my father. They were kind of old when they had me. And I think that he's a very nice man, very considerate, thoughtful, very supportive. She had Alzheimer's. He took care of her. He was just, but he was also kind of boring and straight-laced and repressed. She was a little bit more, sometimes embarrassing in her uncontrolled outbursts and things. But she was, I think she also suffered under that post-World War II suburban conformity thing. It was like classic Betty Friedan situation of the housewife's trap.
Yeah. When you say outburst, do you mean like now when I think of someone like having an outburst, like it's like, hey, look at me, all eyes on me kind of thing? Or is it just that in comparison with the kind of like that 1950s button-down repressiveness, that just like any kind of show of emotion seemed like an outburst?
Well, no, she would just like have these effusions, like say things, blurt things. She was very instinctive, not always very rational, and I find that kind of embarrassing. But she also was, I think, both of them were depressed at some degree, and I think she was in particular. There's a passage in Freud's Morning and Melancholia where he talks about the depressive being very ostentatiously self-sacrificing. Oh, woe is me, that kind of thing. And there's an aggression in that display that the depressive wouldn't admit to, but it's there. And you could feel it. It was just like, she would cook a dinner. She was a very good cook, and that's something else I learned from her. I spent a lot of time cooking, and I really love it. But she would cook a nice dinner, but then stand up at the counter and eat it rather than sitting down with us because she had so much work to do. And it was just like a way of saying, "Oh, how I suffer for you," And it was just like, "Oh, come off it."
Is Freud just describing Jewish parents? Because those are just my parents. That is just like that's just what it is.
My mother's Italian, parents. And I think there are some similarities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Guilt, like they love the guilt induction.
Mm-hmm. So okay, wait. So here's something, because it seems to me that to be leftist at all, you have to have some kind of ethical backbone. I mean, you don't have to. I guess there's, sorry. I say something, I'll state something, and then I'll immediately, my brain will be like, I'm really academic philosophy pilled, in which like my brain will come up with a counterexample and be like, well, a lot of people in DSA who are kind of scummy. So, okay. But in general, to have leftist beliefs, I think you have to at least have some kind of ethical backbone in some way, right? And if you were kind of like turned off by your parents, almost like bloodless duty, how does ethics get in you?
Well, I mean, they were very decent people. I mean, they didn't believe in exploiting people or cheating, or they were very honest about everything. So, I mean, I certainly picked up on that. I did spend some time as a Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and it certainly left its mark on me. Every now and then I feel like a mild relapse setting in, so I think that has something to do with it. The commandments and the sense of being good to others. There's this passage in the New Testament where Jesus says something like, "If you see a beggar on the street, that could be me. So be nice to the beggar." And I thought, that I still think of that very often. Like, if you see some wrong being done, maybe you're offending Jesus. So, there is that very primitive sense that's buried away in some fold of my brain that has an influence on me. But I remember I became a Marxist in 8th grade. I had this 8th grade history teacher who gave a lecture on Marx one day. And he was a real coach type. I don't know where he got it from. But he just gave a 40-minute outline of Marxist philosophy. And I thought, that sounds very appealing. So I came home and announced to my parents that I had to become a Marxist. And they were good New Deal Democrats, and they were scandalized by that news. But it stuck with me. And I certainly didn't really know what that meant. But I said that there were a lot of books in the house, and one of them was Capital, Volume 1. So I read some of that. There was also an anthology of Freud. I read Freud. So then I got bitten by those two people who are still like my major influences as a teenager. And but yeah, I think the politics entered my head at a pretty early age. But Marxists are always funny about pretending it's not about ethics. It's not about morality. It's science. And I never really believed that, but it seems like a stance. But yeah, the ethics of treating others well, not exploiting people, not treating other people as tools for your own power and enrichment. That always appealed to me. I was always there.
Well, not to go back to Kant, but that's there in the categorical imperative. Don't use others as means to an end. And
American life would not be able to go on if people actually obeyed that rule.
Well, yeah, but that's what I think is interesting there, because in this bloodless, what I'm calling like a bloodless duty, right? Because Kant's whole thing is just about you're supposed to do it, and you're supposed to not get any pleasure from it. And if you do get pleasure from it, you're not being ethical. It's no longer an ethical thing that you're doing if you get something from it, right? Which seems to me like it appeals to me, and in the same way it seems insane to me, because I'm like, well, how do you ever do that? How do you shut off your emotional core like that?
Yeah, I think that's psychologically impossible, really.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you started reading Marx or Freud, like, did this become like, oh, this this is like my identity? Like, did you start to kind of like internalize it as who you were? Or was it just like in the same way that, well, this is dumb, but like in the same way, like I started to listen to ska in when I was 17, and I was like, yeah, this is my identity for about a year. And then I started listening to other music.
Yeah, I was a plainclothes punk rocker too in my early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had this friend in high school, a girl I had a crush on, unrequited crush on, who said to me once, like, why are you a Marxist? You know, you can really like score in this world, you know, be rich and successful. You know, she later joined the Peace Corps, so she was not like, and she's not, didn't live her rebuke of me. But it was, I guess, as seen as a little weird in that regard for not wanting to make the most of or make the material most of my endowments, such as they were.
Did you enjoy that in some sense? Like, was there a certain amount of pleasure in othering yourself like that? Were you already kind of like apart from the rest of the group?
Oh, I was always a weirdo. Yeah, I was, you know, the brainy weirdo in the corner. And I always felt kind of awkward, socially awkward. And I still feel that way a lot of the time.
Sure.
But by late high school, I've found this group of friends with who are in similar situations, but also these were the days when there were hoods, the bad people, the bad kids. And yeah, it was the hoods versus the collegiates and the jocks. That was the typology of my high school. I don't know what you'd call these folks now. Burnouts? I don't know what you'd call, I don't know if there's such an analogous situation, but it's, like the leather jackets and, smoking cigarettes in the parking lot and all that kind of thing.
The Fonzies.
Yeah. And so I had a couple of hood friends too, because we all just were united in thinking that the mainstream was insufferable. So there was that sense of being counterculture.
Okay, so that was there from an early age, just kind of like oppositionality. I don't know if that's the right.
Well, that Kink song, I'm not like everybody else.
Interesting. Doug, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
How do you feel? You said again at the beginning, you were like, I don't know if my childhood's that interesting. Do you feel that it's more interesting now?
Yeah, I've developed a new appreciation for it. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye. Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye.